Welcome, welcome. My name's Captain McD, and today we're going to make chocolate cookies with white chocolate chips in them. First thing we need to look at is our ingredients and tools for this recipe. So, first up, we're going to need a cup of butter, 2 cups of sugar, I'm using white granulated, 2 eggs, 2 tablespoons of vanilla, it can be pure or artificial, 2 cups of flour, I'm using all-purpose, 3/4 cup of cocoa powder, half a teaspoon baking soda, 2 teaspoons baking powder, half a teaspoon salt, and 2 cups of white chocolate chips. Also, if you only have soda or powder, I will give you a conversion to use only one when we are doing the recipe. Next up, we're going to go to our tools. We need an oven, some baking sheets, parchment paper or like a non-stick mat, a cooling rack, oven mitts, a spoon and scoop, measuring cups and spoons, a whisk, a flat edge, something like a butter knife, a fork, and a rubber spatula. And once we've got all of those things ready, we can begin. But don't forget, it's very important that every time you cook, you're going to want to wash your hands. 20 to 30 seconds in warm soapy water. It's very important throughout the process. Whenever your hands are more dirty, always put that cleanliness buff back on. We've got our nice sparkle cleanly buff there. And if you've got long hair, tie it back. Let's get baking. So first up, you're going to grab a large mixing bowl and we're going to start with the dry ingredients. So I'm grabbing the flour here. A very important part of the process is correct measurements. So I'm going to show you how to correctly measure the dry ingredients. You're going to take your measuring spoon and your flat edge. So I'm going to use the back of a butter knife. A lot of people use your finger, but it is a little bit curved, so that's why a flat edge is more accurate. You want to overfill your cup, use the back of the butter knife where it's flat, and scrape off the top. That's a nice, perfect measurement. So for easier recipes like cookies, this is not super important that it's exact. You could use your finger, but it's really good to get in the habit of doing proper measuring, because when you try to do a more advanced recipe, it will affect the finished product. Next up, I'm going to do the salt. So this one, I suggest measuring not directly over your bowl, because you can't flatten off your spoon without getting excess salt into the bowl. So I'm going to measure it over a measuring cup so I can fully fill that spoon but cut off the top, flat again, and put it in the mixing bowl. Now we've got our baking powder, and after that I'm going to do baking soda. As I said, I will tell you the conversion for these. So 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda is equivalent to a full teaspoon of baking powder if you're going to convert them in the recipe. I like to use a mix. They work slightly differently, and I find the taste of the baking powder a little bit less strong in my finished recipes. So here's our baking soda. And this is going to be a half teaspoon. Make sure it's a nice flat measure and put it in our bowl. The baking powder was 2 teaspoons if you missed, and the flour was 2 cups. Next up is cocoa powder. This one we need 3/4 cup. I'm just going to use a 1/4 cup scoop and do it 3 times. And again, nice flattened off measurements there. Perfect. In the bowl. On my first few videos, you're going to notice I show the full time that it takes to do these steps. That's because I've seen so much of magic of TV where everything's pre-measured and everybody thinks that it takes 10 minutes to make your entire recipe. I don't really like that that's a thing, and people think they can do it in 2 seconds, so I do want to display about what a real time would take for people. So now that we've got all our dry ingredients in a bowl, we're going to take our whisk and mix them up. This is going to act as our sifting process. If you're doing something really delicate like a sponge cake, you still want to sift your ingredients. But for cookies, this will do the job perfectly. It'll break up any lumps in your cocoa powder, and it will make sure that our ingredients are nicely mixed together and like an even mix, so when we add them to the wet ingredients, we don't have like a surprise clump of salt, or like all the baking soda is in one cookie and none of the other ones have any puff to them. So yeah, this is really gonna save us time and make a nice even mix there. Perfect. So when you're done that, we can set it aside. And we're gonna start with what's called the wet ingredients. So that's gonna be the butter and sugar to start. My butter, I never remember to take out of the fridge before I'm going to bake. So I'm going to show you how to soften it if you are like me and don't prepare in advance. So that little bowl is just going to be so that it can fit in my microwave easily. And I'm going to use the tabs on the side of the butter packaging to measure. Mine's not a full brick, so I'm going to have to use a little bit of this other brick that I have as well. So we're just going to cut a slice of this one off. And it is a little bit angled, so I'm cutting off the edge there to try and make it a straight block to add. Line it up there. It looks like my other brick has a little bit of a chunk out of there. So this is at my 1 cup mark, but I do need to add a small triangle to fill in that space and make the full cup. Perfect. So now we're going to break it up into smaller chunks for our softening process. If you leave it in one big chunk, it tends to get melty in some parts and still hard in other parts. So if you cut it up and spread it around the bowl, it's going to work best. Nice and even in the 4 corners, and just try and make sure it's not going over the side so it doesn't melt all over your microwave. So now we are at the microwave. You are going to see there are on most microwaves now a soften setting. And mine actually has different codes for what you're softening. So number 1 is butter. So we're going to use that one. And what this does is it affects the power level your microwave is cooking at. So if you have slightly older models, you can just change the power level to less strong instead of having a softening function. So soften. And 1. That means it's butter, and we're going to say start, and it's going to fill a time in automatically. Depending on your recipe, you might not need the full amount of time it gives, or if you're doing a really large recipe and you're doing more, you might need to do it twice. So I like to take mine out halfway through and give it a poke so that I don't over melt it. We really don't want oil in the bottom, but we do want it soft enough to mix and get the texture of a cookie. Also, if you have an even older microwave, you can't affect the power levels, you don't have a soften button, just put it in for like 10-second intervals, check it, mix it, put it back in so that you don't over melt the butter. Let's give it a little check here. So I'm just going to poke it with my finger. What I want is an easy poke mark. This is I'm having to put a fair amount of pressure and my finger's not going in, except for on that side piece. So that's alright, but we're going to put it in again. And I left my settings as they were, so we're just going to hit start again and continue on this time that it already had on there. But yeah, creaming I think is the most important part of a cookie to get the ideal cookie texture. And you don't have to worry about overmixing when you cream because there's no flour in it at that point. So you're not going to make a tough cookie. So you can always mix it more, but you can't go back and mix it later if you missed the creaming process. This looks much nicer. We're going to use this as it is. So now I'm going to take it out of the small bowl and into a larger mixing bowl so we can add sugar to it and actually have room to mix. So the rubber scraper is just so that you can get the full amount of the butter and not leave half of it stuck to your bowl. And if you see there was no oil. That's the ideal that you want. If you do melt your butter for a recipe, it will not ruin the ending taste. It just affects the texture of your finished cookie. It'll be a denser, tougher sort of texture, less fluffy. Okay, so now we're going to do our sugar, and same thing as the dry ingredients. We want to overfill our cup, then cut it off with the back of the butter knife. Overfill there, and flatten. 1 and 2 cups is what we need. Poof. So we're going to close that back up and start mixing. I am going to mix with a fork. We want to do a push down motion at the beginning, and that's mostly just because I don't want to make a mess. Right now, if I wildly mixed with the fork, I would definitely spill sugar over the side. So if you do a gentle push down motion, then you kind of break up the butter into the sugar, and once you get all of it moistened and initially combined with the butter, then you can mix it more aggressively and it won't make a mess. Also, the fact that I am using a fork for this is because I do want to highlight in a lot of these videos that you don't need a fancy mixer to bake at home. I grew up without any fancy tools in our household and we still loved to bake. It just takes a little more effort, a little more elbow grease, but that's also fun. It makes the process take a little longer, makes it a good family thing. If our arms got tired, me and my siblings would take turns mixing stuff, so everybody feels a little bit involved. And I think that the average household doesn't need a $300 to $700 mixer in it, so a fork will do fine. I am going to show a couple things probably in the videos that are more geared to the craft sort of tools, but nothing that I think is a high price point. Something that I think anybody could afford if they're going to bake frequently. So we're going to keep pushing down. It's almost combined here. Make sure you scrape the sides of the bowl. That's how you're going to get all of the sugar mixed into that butter. And you'll notice it will be like no more white bits is when it is going to stop making a mess. It'll all look yellowish because it's mixed into the butter. So there we go. You can see just around the edges there's no more white dustings of sugar. That means I can